Do you know if I'm using this? Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Resilient Hurunui March presentation. Tonight, as you can see, we're in this new hall, this Rui Alley hall, slightly different. The toilets, if you require them, are out of this door and across into that little building over there. In event of an adverse event, I've got a torch, and there are exits each side if we need to move out quickly. Apart from that, I think we're all set. Very pleased tonight that we've got Colin Meurk with us, who I think some of you know very well. Colin from University of Canterbury, Manaaki, Whenua, is going to talk about Greening Waipara, and I don't think he needs any more introduction from me than that, so I shall hand over to Colin. Colin, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So this is on. Thank you so much for inviting me. Kia ora koutou. I feel a little bit of an imposter because, of course, I know a number of you in the audience and some very special people who were involved and who led the charge on the Greening Waipara project right from the very beginning, but we'll come back to that shortly. The first thing I wanted to say, and it's a rather sad start to the talk, you can see in red here, I've said dedicated to the inspiration of Steve Wratten. Steve Wratten was a professor at Lincoln University, and he was the one that, together with Daryl and others in the local community here, who really set the Greening Waipara project going back in the mid-2000s, 2005, and he kind of provided a lot of the initial resources to make it happen. He got funding from science funding, and he had a whole lot of students who were crawling all over the project to do various things, and provided student labour to do some of the initial planting, and paying for some of the plants as well, a lot of the plants. So he sadly, just as I was about to invite him to come and join us tonight, I learnt that he had had a massive stroke and he died just a bit over a week ago now. So it's a rather sad matter, and some of you, I'm sure, knew him and saw him around during those early days of the establishment of the Greening Waipara project. I put a whole lot of words on this title page, and really, you know, it's up to you, it's up to the Daryls of the room here who have already been heavily involved, who live here, of course, is the most important thing, to see whether, you know, in some small way, I can be a catalyst to kind of rejuvenating the thing. Of course, it always depends on getting some resources to help drive these things, but I thought it was a good opportunity. I was invited, thanks by Viv, to come along last year, but because of COVID that was cancelled, and so here we are tonight, a year on from then, to see whether we can have a conversation. And that's really what my purpose is here, is to kind of get people engaged in the notion, the idea of Greening Waipara, rejuvenating, as I say, the spirit of it. And it's not just Waipara, of course. I realise that many of you come from further afield than just that particular valley. So I saw it very much as a partnership arrangement to achieve ecological integrity, landscape legibility, and that means being able to sort of see and view the history in the land as you kind of pass around and through it. You can actually see the natural and the cultural heritage before your eyes, of which you know, the wine growing industry is a recent layer, but there are a whole lot of other layers beneath that, and I think the identity of a place depends always very much on being able to understand all of your history, the colonial history, the Māori history, the vegetative history, the geological history, and so on. And you know, this understanding leads to you know, an ecological and a historical literacy, if you like, and leading towards you know, the culture of the district, local branding of excellence and care about the environment that we depend upon and live in. So moving along, now I started sort of compiling a list of acknowledgements, and I really apologise for all of those people that I've left off this list. It's always a dangerous thing to start acknowledging people, because inevitably you leave off some of the most important ones there. But some of you will recognise yourselves, and of course I've put Darryl at the top. He wouldn't like to be seen as... well, I won't carry on there on that line, but you know, there are a few very key people that I remember, and there's a lot of people's names who I can't remember, and I apologise to those profusely. But I've also got sort of down the list here a number of people that sort of came in through the period of the initial setting up, and also you may not be aware that there have been a number of visitors from overseas and also local universities who have used this as a classroom. They've brought students from America, Florida, Seattle, and also from Lincoln to come and look at the project here and to kind of understand it a little bit more. There's and of course Mana Whenua were involved in the early discussions, and of course I've mentioned Jamie's plants here. A lot of his nursery grown plants were used in those initial plantings, and as I said, many others which I'm sure you can fill in for me. So I had this in an old presentation, and I'm not quite sure just how relevant it is. I didn't want to get too deep and meaningful about all of this, but you know, what is the meaning of plants? You know, they're the sort of starting point of our ecosystems, and importantly, you know, they represent lots of different things for different people, and they can be symbols of power, of control and order, as well as beauty and life, and also psychological and spiritual need. You know, there's a whole sort of idea now that came out of Japan, I believe, Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, as it's sometimes translated to. Doesn't mean sort of romping around in the nude and forest, but it's about sort of just absorbing the good vibes from nature and connecting to nature. And we increasingly, and there's, you know, scientific evidence now of the importance and value of doing that to our physiology and to our general well-being. I don't think that's me. So it's also, as I mentioned already, important to landscape and cultural identity, and we're also, by restoring and protecting our indigenous nature in the landscape, addressing, you know, one of the multiple emergencies facing the planet, as well as New Zealand, biodiversity emergency in particular. And this kind of contributes to a unique sense of place, our own particular species. The reverse of that is when people are so separated from their particular nature that they sometimes call it extinction of experience. If all you experience is something completely foreign to this place, and introduced, like when I look out, well, I can see some harakeke there and a few things there, but a lot of the dominant vegetation around us is from other parts of the world. So what is this saying about, you know, our sense of place? In a sense, you know, we're all suffering from a bit of extinction of experience, and we need to kind of recover that, our identity with our place and our particular species. And of course, you know, as was originally intended, that there is this symbolism contributes to commercial sort of outcomes. You know, we've promoted New Zealand as clean and green, and we've tried to project that to visitors and to people buying our products. And this is, increasingly being challenged, and we have to kind of like step up to the mark, if you like. But as well as that, there's a whole lot of so-called nature services, and that's one of Steve Wratten's words. Actually, it's technically called ecological ecosystem services, I should say. Things like filtration of sediment and nutrients through wetlands. Timber, sequestration of carbon through forests, etc., etc. All of those things which we depend on, pollinators and so on. These are ecosystem services which can be monetised. You can sort of put a dollar figure on them. But it's important to note that some of those services are also cultural and health-giving aspects to human well-being. Okay. So I'm going to be soon giving you a whole lot of pictures of the early stages of the product. It'll be of the Greening Waipara product. That sounds very commercial, and how some of the sites have developed. Partly just to give you a flavour of how Greening Waipara sort of percolated its way through the whole Waipara Basin. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to start off with a sort of slight theoretical construct of forest patches or vegetation patches in the landscape, because it's quite important in terms of what all of these individual little restoration projects mean in the bigger picture of the whole landscape or the whole catchment. And really it sort of boils down to the fact that we know that having patches at given distances apart from one another, that wildlife can kind of use these as stepping stones. We know that you need patches of certain sizes to support certain kinds of wildlife. And when I'm saying this, I do understand that some wildlife is not very friendly to some of your grapes. But that aside, there's various ways of dealing with that. But there are, to have sort of large patches at, widely spaced parts of the landscape ensures that seeds can be carried from those by kererū, by tui, by bellbirds and so on, into all the intervening spaces where people live, work and play in the matrix in between. But if you've got other smaller patches at, say, kilometre spacing, then it provides some more stepping stones for those wildlife to kind of move around. And if these are connected by corridors, then some of the more sedentary organisms like lizards and invertebrates, beetles and so on, can also sort of gradually creep from one patch to another. And that's even more so when you've got even smaller patches at regular intervals scattered through the working landscape. They could be just a grove of a few trees, or like many of the Greening Waipara patches, they're just like 100 or 200 square metres or so. They're not massive things, but they nevertheless provide a habitat and a stepping stone for some of our endangered wildlife, because all of our plant species usually have a very host-specific arrangement with a range of other creatures. But the other important thing about this model is that it not only provides what we call ecological integrity, in other words, it provides a living structure that enables the ecosystem to function, but it also means that people living within this and who travel into it are continually reminded of their natural history. They see the smaller patches, they see the corridors joining them along the streams or along the roads, and they see them, in their own vineyards. And that helps to overcome that extinction of experience issue that I referred to. Right, what's next? Okay, so there's just a bit of a sort of picture of the kinds of vegetation that was once, very common in these basins. A very dry country most of the time, and we had a lot of these small-leaved avaricating shrubs and the cabbage trees or tikoka, silver tussocks, etc. and other sort of small leaf trees which could deal with the drought and also the occasional frost here. And I just want to emphasise how important even tiny spaces can be in terms of providing valuable habitat for often quite small species of wildlife, insects and so on, but they all play a part. And so this is just a garden involving, a whole lot of rare endangered species, for example. And this actually is a garden, I think it's actually in England, believe it or not. It's just a few square metres, but it's got about half a dozen different habitats in it. Okay, and as I've already mentioned, the interconnection between plants and animals, I don't need to dwell on that anymore. And the sort of final part of this little part of the story is, of course, the cultural connectivity of this. We all know that the first peoples here, of course, were dependent on all the indigenous plants and animals that were on the land here. Of course, we also depend on it in different kinds of ways, but there are a whole lot of stories around that. And for example, totara was a greatly revered tree, very durable timber, and used for canoes or waka and making meeting houses and so on. And it was a symbol of strength. Well, of course, the first European farmers that came here also discovered how valuable it was for making fence posts and buildings and so on because of that durable nature of it. Right, we're getting a bit closer to the real nub of the talk now. So this is a map of the Waipara Basin, and this was what had been achieved by 2008, which was 3 or 4 years after the initial plantings, which were done at the mud house, which I think is now called Waipara Hills. Am I correct in that? And please forgive me if I'm a little bit out of date with some of the names. I didn't have time to kind of go back and research what they're all called now, and some of them have changed their names and changed hands and so on. But there's a series of slides which sort of preceded this for each year, but the final step showed 42 properties were involved in this, and there was a grand total of 18,695 plants that were planted as part of the Greening Waipara project. So it started about 2005, and that first major effort was completed by 2008. But of course, people here have continued to maintain it and look after it. Okay, there was a bit of a historical precedent, which was kind of some kind of predecessor, I suppose, because back in the 1980s, and correct me if I'm wrong here, there was a beautiful New Zealand project in New Zealand, and some of you may remember that, and I think it was promoted by one of the national MPs. I've just forgotten, someone can probably remind me, and basically it was provided funding to support planting of amenity species along the roadsides and to make them beautiful. It wasn't particularly targeted at native species, although a lot of native species were grown for it. I think the old Ministry of Works nurseries, I think, were running the program actually, and I remember I knew one of the people that was involved. Okay, so they got a lot of stuff right, and there was a number of beautiful New Zealand plantings around Amberley, in fact, and this is just north of Amberley. Sadly, they didn't quite get their species right, because this big Nio-looking plant here is actually an Australian species. So I'll come back to this topic. In terms of getting it right, you've got to kind of get it right. So it's interesting. I just took this picture today, actually, as I was sort of cruising around, getting a few last-minute views of the region. Okay, right, here we start. Here we've got the beginning. And Mud House, I think I'm right, so it's called Waipara Hills now, is that correct? Yep. Is anyone from here from Waipara Hills? No? Okay. So you know where I'm talking about anyway. This was, you know, grassy lawn out here in front of their vineyard, cellar and so on. And so this was those bunches of students that came out and a few other community volunteers. We selected the species suitable to the environment, or what we thought would be suitable to the environment, we got them all planted there. We prepared the site ahead of time, of course, and over time this gradually turned into that. And here is Steve Wratten. I should have got another better image of him, but this is the Steve Wratten that I referred to, and who I regard this talk as sort of dedicated to. So you can see some of those plants that were planted there. They've grown up a little bit, and a couple of years later from the planting, and then a year later, you know, they're starting to grow up and get a bit bigger. And I should note Jean-Luc, who was the sort of vintner from there, who was very involved in looking after this. And so a lot of the performance here, I think, can be put down to his commitment over the time. Again, a year or two later, 2011, you see it's now closed, the canopy is closed, the underlying grass and weeds have been suppressed, and also there were some plantings along the vineyard rows, some ground cover plants and some vines, which we'll see in a little while. So here's again a little bit later on, this is Wendy McWilliam from the Landscape Architecture Department at Lincoln University with some of her students, and we've got some signage now to identify the plants. This was part of a biodiversity trail, so some of the vineyards kind of created these plantings around a kind of a trail so that people could have a glass of wine and go for a bit of a wander and be informed about the local biodiversity and so on. I think that's something we can pick up on later. Could be maybe the profile of that could be sort of raised a little bit more. And then I think this is the final one I've got, 2019, from Washington State University. A group visited, and you can see now, you know, the trees are quite big. Bearing in mind, you know, it's quite a harsh environment unless you pour lots of water onto it. And so these trees are now sort of more or less managing themselves. You know, they're not giving extra resources like water. So, you know, they've taken their time to sort of build up. You know, in a much better, well-watered environment, you'd expect the trees to be much bigger and different species to be involved. I mentioned the underplanting, the ground cover. There's lots of little native herbaceous and mat-forming sub-shrub species. There's geraniums and muehlenbeckias and some raulias, some scabweeds and things. Doesn't sound very pretty, does it? But that there is one of these riverbed plants, and there's some geraniums here. And also at the end of the vines, we planted some native vine species, in this case the New Zealand jasmine, but it could also be some native clematis and so on. So, you know, there's lots of places where you can incorporate native biodiversity. But I should be honest and say it does take a bit of commitment, it does take a bit of time and effort. You know, you do have to sort of garden this to a degree. But a lot of these species would be quite capable of being managed by, for example, you know, sheep grazing under there. And I think you do occasionally graze sheep in vineyards. I'm not the expert here. I'll go back to Daryl or someone. But, you know, there's various ways of sort of managing some of these things. Okay, so I showed you there some vine rows, but there are other linear features. I mentioned the importance of corridors connecting the bigger patches. This was the Camshorn, I think, along the main highway there. I'm open to be corrected in terms of some of these names because I've lost track. But there's a whole range of native species, shrub species, the kind of rare and across New Zealand, the rare Muehlenbeckia estonii, or Toruraro, which is found along the Waipara Gorge Valley, and naturally occurring there. So it's a very sort of appropriate and suitable species to be growing in this area, and is greatly adding to the protection and long-term survival of that particular species. Again, I mentioned that it's a really important genus of plants for some of our native butterflies, for some of our native lizards, and also for some of the little birds as well. So it has a lot of food value for native wildlife. There's narrow-leaved lacebark here, there's the tikoka, the cabbage tree, there's some flaxes, and there's probably other small-leaf coprosmas in that group there. One of the important biodiversity trails was the Donaldson's Pegasus Bay site, and they had a bit of a launch with the Po here to commemorate the local tangata whenua, First Peoples on the land, and again there's a nice little walk that weaves its way around and connects up different areas of vegetation on quite a steep slope, and then down on the valley floor next to a pond. So there's lots of different variations on the theme, and I'm just going to sort of flick through some of the places. Some of those 42 different sites, only probably about a tenth or a quarter of those, but nevertheless, Waipara Springs here, again you can see the students out doing that initial planting. And a little bit later on, a few years later down the track, again they've got a little bit biodiversity trail there and here, sort of in amongst the gum trees. But you know, it's all sort of gradually building up, and of course the step that follows is when those plants start to produce fruits and start to flower and produce seedlings. The Torleas wine site is a really important one. Again, they've got a biodiversity trail there, and this is sort of early stages, 2011 you can see, but a little bit later on it's grown up quite substantially here, and you've got even almost like a woodland walk here. Here's Kim, and see the trail from different perspectives here. This is along the main highway, again with all of those divaricating small leaf shrubs, the ever-present tikoka cabbage tree, but some of these are ribbon woods and lacebarks, and the broadleaf plants. So you know, these are all part of the sort of structure of a dry forest. In some places we've got some of our big future giant trees. I mean, they won't be giants here, but totara and matai in particular, but they're very slow growing, and I was just looking at one today, and it on a fairly dry site opposite the Camshorn corridor that I showed you before, and you know, it's struggling. You know, it's up about this high, but the top bit of it sort of died back a little bit in the drought. But when you've got, you know, good deep soils, you know, perhaps along a floodplain next to a river, then you can expect those things to do a bit better. This is Waiata, in fact, just opposite, just near the place I was telling you about. In fact, I think the totara I'm referring to is sort of in the middle of here. So you know, it's a small patch. It's maybe a couple of 100 square meters or so, but as I said, it's providing one of those important stepping stones, and also a visual cue in the landscape as you sort of pass through it. Waipara Terraces, I think that's right, 2006, early planting, and I'm not sure about this, whether I've got the right name here. Someone will correct me about this. I'll look into it. But you know, we planted around some of the ponds as well. And where have we got to now? Another one, and I think this is somewhere near Waipara River Estate, or Three Sisters. Sorry, I apologise again for not having time to properly kind of go back and get the right names for some of these places. It was just in my photo collection. But this one, importantly, shows some remnants of the original grey scrub, as it's sometimes called. The matagari, or the correct Māori pronunciation is tumatakuru. I'm going to come back to the importance of protecting these remnants, because they're few and far between, and sadly they're even getting less as we speak. I think that's called Waipara Gardens there, just not far from Daryl's place. That was planted a little bit later. Oh gosh, there's Daryl's front yard. We haven't revealed his address, so you won't you won't be able to be stalked too easily. But we've also got someone from way down the back of the hall there who's admiring the wonderful, very good performance of trees at that site. Again, you know, you can recognise the places where there's been a lot of love and attention gone into it. And you know, this is tells you how that happens. So it's basically got an external hedge of these divaricating shrubs, very drought tolerant, very frost tolerant species, and then, you know, sort of protecting behind some of the taller native trees of a dry forest. I mentioned some of these groups coming from outside of the area and outside of the country. Mark Hostetler and Merrill have been bringing about a dozen or so students from Florida every year for the last 10 years, except last year, and it looks like this year, sadly. But prior to that, they'd been coming every year, and this was one of their important stops to come and see the Greening Waipara project. And I think Mark actually even took part in some of the early plantings, because he was here around the time that was being started up. And that's another view from Mountford, looking down onto their detention basin there, and some of the plantings there, and also around the pond. Oh, look! Now, have I spelt you right?
Well, no.
No, it's an A. Sorry about that.
The other one, right?
I think I could have been influenced by someone else then, but anyway, never mind. But nevertheless, is recognisable character here, showing some students the wonderful diverse plantings that have been done down at the vicarage, and you know, some of them are under the trees, protected under the exotic willows and so on, and others are sort of more out along stream sides, and some out in the open. I really kind of recognise the importance of many of you who've maintained and kept the faith going here. I put this one in because it was on that little kind of corner at Waiata, because I saw that this Caprosma crassifolia, as it's called in the trade, has got little fruits on it, lovely little white fruits, and as I said, this is where regeneration begins. And I think, and I know that Sue has spent a lot of time looking out at all of these sites and going and finding seedlings of many of the species that we've planted now. So the process, the cycle, the great life cycle is in place. There are seedlings developing, and these are often the best performing plants compared to planted ones. Because planting is always, you know, we're second guessing where they should go, and there's a whole lot of important techniques in planting correctly, and you know, and there's a bit of diversity in how well, you know, a big bunch of people who come in and volunteer to plant, how well they do that job. And you know, if they don't do it well, then the plants don't survive or perform so well. Okay. So there probably are some little seedlings of karamu down here. This is just to kind of show some of the other features that were built in around the Greening Waipara thing, the information delivery, notice boards telling you about the species there. There were kind of lizard lounges under these corrugated tiles, and it had wetter motels, places to support some of the macro invertebrates that would be very prone to being scoffed up by a lot of introduced animals like rats and mice and etc. etc. There are other things that scoff up our precious plants too. Most of our plants are like ice cream to all of the introduced mammals that we've brought into the country because they didn't evolve in the presence of those voracious herbivores. And so here's some examples in the early days of hare and rabbit damage. Knocking back the kowhai here and the broadleaf there. These really are ice cream plants. You know, any woolly animal will kind of just love those things. So you've got to provide initial protection until they get up big enough to defend themselves. One of the other problems that's arisen from a weed pest sort of point of view, I haven't noted that it's happened here, but in some other parts on the Canterbury Plains, some of the kānuka, which of course is one of the ideal and natural species of the dry woodlands that would have covered these plains, have been attacked by a scale insect, and it's been quite devastating in places. So just something to be aware of. We don't really have a proper response to it yet. You know, there come biological controls, there are various sort of sprays and things, but I know one property owner who's had a great battle with it, and he's had great difficulty you know, maintaining his lovely wooded collection of kānuka. So the jury's still out a little bit on that. Okay. I'm sort of beginning to wind up here now, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know. I want to sort of just finally focus on where to from here, but also to note that what we're trying to do is mimic nature to create habitats through the cultural landscape that actually were a natural part of the environment in their niche, in their place, so that they appear to be natural. So the landscape has more of a natural character, if you like. And the models that we've got are, you know, remnants often in places that you can't, you know, put a plough, and you can't graze animals and so on. You can't create vineyards. So they're often in these very steep, sort of protected areas. And you know, there's Tumatakuru, Matagauri, there's four-leaf coprosmas, there's Muehlenbeckias, and a range of other sort of native plants that grow in those situations. So these are kind of very important to maintain. And here you can see at the back of Mountford, I think, again, Matagauri and kānuka remnants, these dark shrubs in the background, the Matagauri in the foreground here. And of course the silver tussocks scattered along the dry hills out in some open grazed areas. So these are all native species that can tolerate, some of the few that can tolerate browsing by introduced mammals. So they're good to retain. But importantly, and I'll move on actually to some other pictures of Matagauri. So here's some lovely Matagauri on Damien's property. And I just really want to tell you how wonderful these plants are. They're New Zealand's only native spiny plant. They're in the buckthorn family. They're extremely slow growing. I mean, these plants here could be 100 years old, and they can last for hundreds of years. They've got great big trunks on them, and sort of old man Matagauri is sort of a phenomenon of floodplains and so on. But they're more than that. They actually have in their root systems a kind of a bacterium thing, an actinomycete it's called, which actually fixes nitrogen. So they're a bit like a legume. They actually have a microorganism in their roots which actually adds nitrogen to the soil. But more than that, they actually provide pollen and nectar for a little native fly. It's called a tachinid fly. And this fly actually parasitizes grass grub. So you can see one of the unintended consequences of clearing the land to make it suitable for farming and pasture and stuff has been to eliminate the source of the natural biological control of the grass scrub, which subsequently exploded when you took it all away. So I think we should make a halt on getting rid of more of it. It's still being sprayed off, it's still being seen as rubbish, it's still being lost, and yet it's performing that important function, but it's also an important visual element of the landscape. So, and I've got a bit of a sort of sad note coming up about that. But anyway, first of all, I also mention some of the other remnants. This in fact is not local, but there are quite a few examples of this Muehlenbeckia or Pohuihui that grows as a wonderful hedgerow. In fact, here it's actually taken over from an original gorse hedge. And I mentioned already that Muehlenbeckias perform that important role in providing food for butterflies and lizards. But it's one of the few native species that actually, woody species, is actually resistant to browsing. It's sheep and cattle and goats and what have you aren't interested in it. So that's one of the reasons it performs quite well here. But it does provide, a really nice, natural, kind of organic fence line, and performs all those ecosystem services at the same time. Okay, I want to kind of move away from a bit of negativity here, but I went driving around Waipara this afternoon, partly to find some examples of other remnants Matagauri along the fence lines. And I have to say I was a little bit demoralised to find that for all the best reasons, we've sanitised, we've cleaned off whole roadsides here which had scattered shrubs of Matagauri on them and some other native shrubs. I think in some cases coprosmas and probably other Muehlenbeckias growing sort of on the hedges. Now, I kind of understand the motivation for this, but this is gone since my last visit. And, these were sort of old man Matagauri. They were probably 100 years old. And so it was kind of rather sad, and hence my sad face there, to see that. Okay, I want to kind of move away, but it's so important to make sure before you clear any land that you know what it is you're clearing, that these are precious, these are the gold. They are so much more important than a planted specimen. But of course, when you've lost all of the original remnants, then planting specimens is really important too. But, I just want to get that, the priority there sort of right. Okay, so in a sense, this has been going on for ages. Death by a thousand cuts, we know all that, sanitising the landscape. It's the history, it's the models. We can only make educated guess where things go, so we prime the pump by planting things and then hopefully waiting for seedlings to establish themselves in the places that they want to be. So it's important we also plant the right stuff, local stuff, and then of course to selectively remove unwanted weeds and pests and so on. So almost at the end here, just throwing out a few thoughts. I reiterate what I said at the beginning. I see this as just contributing to a conversation. Some of the things that came to my mind when I was sort of putting this together, why are we doing this? What's it for? Initially there was the notion of branding about providing ecosystem services, these nature services, and Steve Wratten was big on that, providing habitat for friendly invertebrates that would feed on other pest species and all that kind of thing. We need to sort of be careful with our weeding. We need to do it. We need to sort of get rid of the pest things and to do some more sort of smart planting to start bringing, enriching the plantings that we've already done, seeing what survived, what's worked, and then building on that. There's other things too about the site and plant signage. So probably some of these need to be upgraded a bit now, looking a little tired. And Daryl tells me that there is or was a big Greening Waipara sign at each end of the district, so that, you know, it's welcoming people, so it's just sort of promoting that, and the trails, of course, that operate, joining that to the biodiversity trails and to the Greening Waipara project in general. Organics, there'll be others here can say much more about that. You know, there's technology that's being developed to make some of the kind of weeding operations more, a little bit easier to deal with. Robotic mowers, for example, that can go up and down vine rows, etc., or between planted trees. Noting that, you know, the beautifying thing, you know, people have got different aesthetic views on, you know, what's messy and what's tidy. Joan Nassau was an American landscape ecologist who dreamed up this thing called Cues for Care, in which she's sort of described how, you know, we need to sort of accommodate people that want order and control and tidiness on the one hand, by having a nice tidy frame around the ecosystem that's operating messily in behind. So, you know, we can do both. We can satisfy both needs out there. Right, so landowners, as I'm discovering, are continuing to plant, they're continuing to weed and look after their plants. This is obviously a relatively new planting. It postdates the Greening Waipara time. We need to make sure again that we do the right stuff. You know, there are one or two things which are a little bit out of range, and for example, a lot of the border planting in the northern outlet of Amberley here is a North Island Carokia. They're very easy to propagate. You can do it by cuttings, and so that's probably one of the reasons why it was cheaper to do it that way than to plant the real local native Carokias. Just a little sort of detail there. So I think, in conclusion, lots of great stuff has been done. More stuff is happening. We've got patches, corridors, nature services, branding. It seems to be, you know, there's a time to coordinate and bring all of this together again, and to achieve, you know, that landscape integrity and identity and all the values that come out of it, as I sort of have described. So I just sort of say, go Greening Waipara. I'm personally very happy to help and contribute again, you know, as we did those 16 years ago. So thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions or comments for Colin? And I'm the human microphone stand, by the way. That's what I'm sending you.
It won't pick you up if
Dead.
Cheviot, of course, provide a lot of the material for those initial plants. But I understand there are people in the audience here who are also involved with plant propagation, and I think they should be able to speak for themselves. Importantly, you know, it should be involving locally sourced material from the immediately surrounding district. Of course, there's not much of original vegetation left down on the bottom of the basin. You've got to go around the fringes to get it. But just to be wary of the points that I made at the end there. And also, importantly, and I just reiterate, to protect any surviving remnants in situ is absolutely vital. You know, that is the history, that is the gold.
First, I think there was one person shooting right at the top of this, was Colin Meurk. He's put a huge amount of work through Landcare and his own time over the last 16 years, incredible amount. And he was probably the reason when Steve had run out of funding and the students, and that I kept on going as best I could with the project. It's apt that we're having this night tonight, because only about 6 weeks ago I went to a party at Damien's and one said, oh, what's happening with the Greening Waipara? I said, well, I'm battling away. I've had the corrections there, I've had this one's doing, trying to keep it going. But I think I'm going to wind it up. And straight away, Amanda and Damien and Alf down the back there said, no, you can't do that. And so these guys are now stepped up, and Damien going to be the chairman, Alf's treasurer, and Amanda's secretary, and I'm going to be there. So we've got funding. Sarah, you must know that we've through Amanda's just applied for more funding. We've got money in the bank. We're doing a little bit different than used to happen. They used to pay 100%. We're doing 50% funding, so the dollar for dollar. So the theory behind that, which I've seen, not in some of the places where plants were put in and people didn't look after them. So if they put that financial bit in themselves, they will look after it. It's just the way it works in my opinion. So we've got money in the bank at the moment. We're applying for more funds, and also I've just sourced about 4 or 5, or as much mulch as I can want from the manager at the landfill. So we've got this mulch. We're going to start getting into it. So anybody that wants to help or wants to do some planting, particularly help, just get hold of one of us. And once again, thank you so much, Colin. It's been an inspiration.
Looks like it carries on, Colin.
Great.
Any more comments or questions? Viv?
Thank you, Darryl, for your work over the years.
It's a bit specialist thing, but they produce dry seeds, and you collect them. I'm not a specialist in plant propagation. There might be others here who can do a better job at describing that. I would normally just be going to a nursery where you've got professionals who know what they're doing. But yes, you can collect the seed. They're dry seed, and you obviously have to collect them before the capsule shatters. But after they're well ripened, in other words, they've gone grey, they've gone away from being green capsules, scatter them on a seed tray and germinate them from there. It seems that they, get their, roots kind of microorganism kind of thing going reasonably easily once they're planted out. But again, I'm not 100% sure about that. Something to investigate.
Yeah, Colin, I just had a question. What can be done about the dying cabbage trees?
So, are you finding that this is a major issue here?
Yeah.
Yes, I have seen a few. I mean, it seems quite variable.
Or even young trees are dying.
So what?
Or even some young ones are dying.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know, are they dying completely or are they just...
Yep.
I've seen a few die back and just cut that diamond off. They're quite a weed.
I've had a couple that, other trees have fallen on.
Fungus.
Well, I don't think it's the, cabbage sudden death thing that afflicted the North Island some years ago.
Some seem to be dying quite quickly.
Could it be drought? Could it be lack of water?
There's a big stand at the golf course, so they haven't been down there for a long time.
I'm
Good place
from
golf.
further north, up around Greta Valley.
Yeah, the Antley golf course is quite a big stand of really old cabbage trees.
They're doing well.
I haven't been, I don't play golf anymore,
Yeah.
but I'm assuming they are. Someone needs to go and check.
I mean, we have had some pretty severe weather in recent years, and just that intense dry, summer after summer has not helped, I'm sure. But one of the places that I visited today, I mean, there's a bunch there. Is that George's Road, I think? They seem to be doing fine.
There are plenty around that look great, and then quite quickly you say, oh.
We see it quite a bit at our place, but quite often it's when they're in isolation, I find, like they're just in the middle of a area, there's no other trees around them, are very exposed, so it could have something to do with trying to survive the climatic conditions within. It's been
think some of these sorts of questions, you know, need a bit further investigation, and you know, that's where partnerships with the universities and stuff can help. You know, we can get some people to kind of have a look at those things and see if they can figure it out.
I wonder if in isolation the wind really rips into them. You know, when you've got a group, there's a bit of protection, but the wind does play havoc with cabbage trees because they've got that.
I mean, they are one of our hardiest trees, and so, you know, it is something that, you know, has undermined their strength in some way or another. But I don't have a definitive answer, but I'd be looking to get some assistance from some of our researchers to see if they can pin it down.
Got a question?
Yeah, what's the geographical area that's covered by the Greening Waipara
Well,
project?
we've done plans, what, through.
Yeah, right. And another question is, like you say, there's funding available. My husband and I have just moved onto Orange Quarry Sculpture Park, and so we're up there, and with my brother Raymond, who owns the place. And just in our surrounding area, there's quite a lot of native vegetation that's getting smothered with old man's beard. So is there any funding to help rescue what's already there, basically? You know, there's some lovely porcupine plant and just lovely little remnants and stuff.
Kilometres of river that are just covered in kilometres.
Yeah, so, yeah, just wondering if the Greening Waipara project takes on any of that kind of
Not
as
at this
well.
stage.
Right.
Well, I think it's realistically we have to organise working bees and just, you know, the planting is the most enjoyable part.
That's right.
And you walk away and then you come back and the grass takes it over. So it's the weeding and monotonous.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking more of remnants, like what Colin's talking about,
Yeah.
the gold that's already there.
Yeah, well,
well
like old man's
established.
beard is, well, you see it on the left a way out. You know, I even had one at my place and those seeds, there's lots of little seeds. And
But isn't the council quite interested in keeping a check on old man's beard?
well, to be fair, I'm not sure where it is on their weed list. You know, they're more concerned
Well,
about
I know
themselves.
that when we ran the medical centre in Waiparra, my God, they were hot on it.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It's interesting you say the council, because we actually, the council was right behind us for quite a number of years. We were getting funding out of Japan on a basis, 40 grand a year. And the council provided a car. You had a surfboard in that car.
Sue?
Did you have that car for a while?
Oh, the one I've got.
No, the council car. There was a council.
Oh.
Dale. Remember Dale? He had it.
Yeah.
You know, it was a car.
Oh.
So all I'm saying is, if someone puts up the thread and just says, because it's just a matter of people doing stuff with you, go to the council, because
I think you should really.
because they were right behind it.
I mean, I think, you know, in an audience like this, and hopefully there's more outside, we'll all have sort of different interests, and some will like to do some protection of existing things and to go out and survey that. Others will do more planting, some will do maintenance, some will do the interpretation, the signage, you know, so there's a whole lot of individual tasks, and I mean, it's not for me to say how you're going to do that, but that's what, you know, looking in from the outside, I would see might form a structure of a kind of rejuvenated kind of group really to do. Divide up those tasks, and because they're all important in their different ways.
Oh, one thing I forgot to mention before too is that some of you might be aware of Nicola Toki. She's so she's been running. She's fairly high up the dock for start, but also she's been running this trapping.
We're a little bit slack at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's trying to push me to be in charge of the thing, which I'm pushing back a little bit.
Well, I've told her she's really keen to combine.
Yeah.
Did she tell you?
Yeah, so she was talking about potentially starting some greening down sort of lower areas where people who don't want to go traipsing up the mountain to check traps and stuff, so greening areas and then trapping those areas to try to obviously keep the bugs available so that the introduced species aren't eating them all the time. So we can go and put traps in areas, if you've got a big native area that you want protected from little furry creatures, we can come in and start trapping those areas to try to protect the native geckos and all the rest of it that might be coming into those areas. So it's just a matter of getting back into it a little bit more. So,
Fast coming initially and helping with the parking.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's true.
Oh, one thing you've got to mention, Colin, we planted it about, I'm not sure we did planting here at Henry, we've definitely got one big planting at Orchard School and one at Young School. And we did one here, this way somewhere, I'm sure. Maybe.
Yeah, the stuff at the school is very good.
Yeah.
Near the railway station.
Leadfield School we did
I work in revegetation, restoration and plant sourcing and organise people to grow vegetables and some I can't get too much later. But I'd just like to say what I really like about Daryl Harrison's front there, that over the years I've photographed it many times, but there's been a lot of natural regeneration in that particular plot, Canterbury and the Hope areas, so that when you do your maintenance well and get your cover up, that's what you have next, you sort of accelerated natural thing happening, so it's not all maintenance, it's about reducing the maintenance and getting nature to a go. So I think Daryl's House is a really good example of that. And I'm also available for anyone to ask questions about how to get projects going or practical aspects. Also run, we'll do propagation workshops. Someone wants to grow something, please be asked.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think like Waipara schools in their new sort of plan are going to sort of look towards the environment a bit more than they have done. But you know, if you could start like propagation things at school where they've got a whole area where they're growing all these native plants and then go out and plant them and carry it on. And sort of I suppose that's been lacking a bit. They sort of had done it for a little bit and then the shine's gone off it. And but if you have a permanent nursery in all these little area schools, then it's just getting people interested in it.
If I could just make a suggestion about that, there's often a desire for communities to set up their own nurseries, and as I think we know, it's a very professional job. Personally, I would like to see any school or any group that wishes to do that they do it in conjunction with, in partnership with some of the existing nurseries who've got all the skills, got all the experience, who know where they're getting the plants from. They're not going to just be getting seedlings off their kitchen garden and getting all the wrong stuff, which is the danger if you don't know what you're doing. So schools, of course, have got space that they can use to grow plants on, more than, say, some of the nurseries may have capacity for. So I tend to believe that that's the kind of way to work it, rather than thinking that they're going to sort of start up a whole nursery themselves. They should be able to see the whole process and learn about that, and also to see how complex it is and all the aspects of knowledge that you need to have. So just,
Is that a convenient point to break for refreshments? If we want to have a chat between ourselves, before we do, I've got the traditional gift to our speaker, which is a bottle of Waipara wine.
Really?
And a cake.
Oh no!
And a cup.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's really been good. And